I'm John Kenyon. I'm the director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We'll be recording this because I know a lot of folks are not able to join us at this time, and hope that they'll be able to watch and join at their own convenience. So I would like to introduce Anna Barker, who's an assistant adjunct professor at the University of Iowa, who, as you all know, led us through a community reading of the Paradise Lost by John Milton. It's our second community reading project following the Decameron that we did earlier this year, and more to come. And Anna will share some details about that, I know. We'll start out really very informally. Let Anna introduce and talk a little bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. I would ask that if you are not actively asking a question, that you keep yourself muted so that we can cut down on crosstalk. And if you would like to ask a question directly, if you can just raise your hand when we get to that point, and Anna can call on folks, and then you can unmute yourself when she calls on you. If you would like me to ask your question instead, I'm happy to do that. You can just put that into the chat, and I will keep track of that, and we can ask some questions that way as well. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce Anna, and if you would like, you can change the view at the top of your screen so that it's just on the speaker so you can keep track of that, or if you just want to see everybody, you can keep it in the Brady Bunch pose the way you probably all came in. So I will now turn it over to Anna.
No, keep seeing everyone. I want everyone to see everyone. Wonderful. So my name is Anna Barker, and I was your gracious hostess for the past 50 days, and we did it. Congratulations. So give yourselves a round of applause. We finished Milton's Paradise Lost, the book that many people start and not enough people finish. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. John and I go way back. I live in Iowa City, Iowa. I teach at the University of Iowa. And I've been a part of the Iowa City Book Festival for the past 10 years. I had the wild idea of taking impossibly long novels into the marketplace and reading these incredibly long novels on city streets in front of the old Capitol by the Iowa City Public Library. And we've done so many of these projects. Started in 2010 with Anna Karenina, and since then we read all of Quixote, volume 1 and 2. In 2015, when the book was celebrating its 400th anniversary, we read Crime and Punishment, Fathers and Sons, Notes from Underground, Moby Dick, and we read War and Peace twice because my students challenged me and said that reading War and Peace out loud once is just not enough. You have to do it twice to make it count. And then the pandemic happened. So last year we were standing on the street corner and reading all of War and Peace out loud. It took 4.5 days. And then the pandemic happened. And as soon as the world shut down, I was immediately calling John Kenyon and telling him, I have just the book we need to read. It's the wildest book ever written. It is so completely inappropriate. It was written during the Great Plague, so it will be completely relatable for what we're facing today, and that was the Decameron. So Boccaccio's Decameron was written when half the population of Florence died from the plague. And what we're facing today is catastrophic and global, but the world has been there before. And so I did a bunch of research on all of the great plagues that hit humanity, from the plague that was happening in Athens during the time of Pericles, to the plague that hit the Byzantine Empire during the time of Justinian. And then, of course, the Great Plague of the 14th century. And well, guess what? Other people were writing books during plagues. One of them is Milton, our friend, the plague of 1665, 1666, that killed 1/4 of the population of London. And it's fascinating that Milton was such a London guy. I mean, he did go to Cambridge, he traveled extensively all over Europe, but he lived most of his life in London. And he did leave London for that short stretch, the 1 year of the Great Plague in London. And that is the time when he was writing Paradise Lost. So this is one of the reasons why from Decameron we turned to Paradise Lost, but also because I love this book. As those of you who have seen some of the notes that I was writing. I literally took this book with me on family vacation once. It happened to be to Hawaii. And I was sitting and looking at the ocean, and I just thought, you know, it's a great book. I would like to get through it. And I had both the audio recording and the epic. And I started listening with my big headphones. And I literally felt that I had a transcendent experience. The words just spoke to me, the language spoke to me. And then I started looking for a way of incorporating this book into a class. You can probably tell I have an accent. I'm a native speaker of Russian and a native speaker of Hungarian. It's just one of those odd combinations. One side of the family was Russian, one side was Hungarian, and I spoke Russian only to one side of grandparents, and Hungarian only to the other set of grandparents. So English is not my native language, but this book really, really got to me in marvelous, wonderful ways. And then I started thinking about it more and more. And I started looking at the history of Reformation, which is an absolutely fascinating period in European history, because Europeans were so spectacularly mean to each other for about 100 years. They decided that they're going to just kill as many of their own kind in Europe as they can in the name of God. And it's fascinating that during this time period, all of these tales of devils and the Mephistopheles, Satan, Lucifer, start becoming very, very prominent. And so I decided to put together all the books where the devil, Lucifer, Mephistopheles are main characters or characters who contribute tremendously to the development of the action. And so I offered a class. It was under a rubric of major texts in world literature. Started with the book of Job, because somewhere here, I think it's propping up my computer. Started with the book of Job, because there is a devilish pact there between God and the accuser to subvert Job. And then divided the class into two sections, actually. One was Milton's Paradise Lost, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a reading of Paradise Lost. Those of you who are familiar with the book probably remember that the creature in Frankenstein is superbly eloquent and very well read. The creature actually finds out about what it means to be a human being from reading Milton's Paradise Lost, in addition to Plutarch's Lives and Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. And then the third book I read in that first unit was Moby Dick. Those of you who read my notes probably realize that I am a huge fan of Moby Dick. And it's fascinating that Melville started writing a book about whaling, and then he got hold of a copy of Paradise Lost. And that has really, really changed that novel. I mean, Moby Dick is a huge homage to Paradise Lost. And in my notes on the books that were inspired by Paradise Lost, I quoted a couple of passages from Moby Dick that, I mean, Captain Ahab would have been impossible without Milton's Satan, or Captain Ahab would have been a very pedestrian character without the huge inspiration from Milton's Satan. And then in the second part of that class, I taught Goethe's Faust, part 1 and 2, and Brothers Karamazov, which also deals with darkness and human souls. And then we finished with this incredibly, incredibly good book that people either know and love or know nothing about it. And it's Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which is a huge homage to both Goethe and Dostoevsky. And so I was teaching this class, and all of a sudden I get an email from a German professor. His name is Waltraud Meyerhofer, and she suggests we meet for lunch. So we did. And she said, Anna, you're teaching this class about the devil in literature. And I'm, yeah, I love it. This is so great. It's, you know, it's my fun class. It's not Russian literature. It's not like work. It's fun, fun, fun. And she said, do you realize that the German department has been offering a class in the past entitled Pact with the Devil, and the course number is 666? Well, at that point, I just about exploded. I mean, it was too perfect. It was just absolutely too perfect. I did not know about that class. I was just completely operating, you know, I was just teaching the books I love. And Waltraud suggested we team up. So we team taught that course for 2 or 3 years. And then her course load took her to teaching courses in German for the German program. And so I've been teaching this class solo for the past 2 years and loving every second of it. So that's the background of how a book that literally blew up my mind on a family vacation in Hawaii, all of a sudden ended up this book that I've been teaching and loving for so long. And I'm teaching this class this semester. So all of those wonderful Facebook posts that I was making were hugely appreciated by my students. And once again, in this class, we did start with the book of Job, which is the foundational text for all of these texts. You know, those of you who read my notes on Milton's Paradise Regained realize just to what extent it happens over and over and over again. It's not just that the dark forces tap a human being and say, hey, you look bored. Would you like to have more excitement in your life? Would you like a better job? Would you like a lot of excitement in your personal life? Would you like to win a big prize? Would you like to know how to connect all of your empirical knowledge and all of your metaphysical knowledge? Would you like to know the unknowable? And the scope of the offer is always so vast. But what is so fascinating in all of these books is the presence of God in all these. And my students and I just had a lot of fun going through Goethe's Faust. And those of you who were faithful followers of all of my outpourings notice that I sneak in a little bit of music into my teaching. And the last 2 classes on Faust were nothing but big opera, because there are 3 operas based on the Faust legend. And I'm going to blast a bunch of opera at my students again this afternoon when I'm teaching. We're finishing Goethe's Faust today. But it's just fascinating to what extent God is ever present in all of these pacts. And I told my students that and we also read Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which chronologically is much closer to the Faust chapbook, which appeared just a few years before Christopher Marlowe turns it into a play. And he's, of course, an Elizabethan playwright and a contemporary of Shakespeare. And what just shocked students, I mean, they've been shocked all semester long. I sometimes ask them at the end of class, so how do you feel? And one of them very timidly said, transcended. So I told the students, well, great. When my family asks me, Anna, you know, what have you been doing in class today? I'll just tell them, I help my students transcend. It's all in a day's work. But what absolutely shocked my students about the Goethe Faust is that God and Mephistopheles have a conversation in the prologue in heaven, and it's sort of the same conversation, the same question and response as in the book of Job. You know, Job asks the deceiver or Satan or the devil, whichever translation the translator chooses to have for the entity in the book of Job. God asks, hey, well, what have you been? What have you done? And I always tell the students that in the book of Job, this devil character is the perfect teenager because he responds, I've been here and there doing this and that. I mean, how perfectly evasive can that be? And at that point, God says, hey, have you bumped into my servant Job? And the devil character says, oh my gosh, he's so boring. You've given him everything. You're like, he's a super boring guy. So that narrative of God saying, well, you know, if you think that he is, he will be receptive to your entreaties, then go ahead and test him. I mean, that shocks students so much, that God is a part of this pact, that God is the instigator of the moment when the dark force approaches a human being. But what shocked them even more so in Goethe's Faust is that God is concerned that Faust is bored. God is concerned that Faust has given up seeking, that thing that Goethe considered to be the most essential human element, exalted striving. Just think about it. What Goethe felt about humanity is that all we need to keep doing is to strive exaltedly. It doesn't matter whether we succeed or not. We just have to keep going. And so for Goethe in his Faust, God's concern is for the fact that good old Faust just gave up. He stopped striving. He stopped caring. And so he sent Mephistopheles to literally kick Faust in the ribs and just tell him, get up, do something, make mistakes. And that was absolutely stunning for the students. I mean, they just assume that there's this positivity in books, and I don't know where they get these ideas. I mean, I'm sure they read negative stuff, and they are fully aware of anti-heroes in books, but they expect this positivity, and it shocks them that in the case of Faust, what the plea is to keep doing something. And so I was 17 years old when I read this book. This is my oldest literary acquaintance, and this became pretty much the blueprint of my life. So exalted striving is what I do, and the results be damned. As you probably realize by now, I am not a Milton expert, but I play one on Facebook. So those are my Facebook credentials. And I absolutely love teaching all of these books precisely because they make my students think. I don't give them answers. I don't ask them to read critical material about the books. I just really want them to feel the pain and feel the joy. They come to my classroom and are just completely befuddled. They ask me, do you mean to say I am allowed to think what I want to think about the book? And I tell them, yes, and you will have to write 10 reflections for this class that will start with the sentence, I love or I hate. I want it to be that visceral. I want you to really, really, really get into the habit of loving reading books without waiting for the approbation of some kind of academic angel who would be hovering above their shoulder and saying, no, you are not allowed to think that. They're allowed to think everything. They rejoice and they're terrified. And then we just dive into these books, and I basically tell them, if you've ever loved or hated, if you've ever felt frustrated, if you've ever felt unworthy of being a human being, if you ever transcended, if you ever did a super kind thing without anyone knowing, or if you ever did a super horrible thing and bragged about it, you are ready to read the great books because they are written by human beings who have suffered, and you do not spend a lifetime or 20 years writing a masterpiece so that University of Iowa undergraduates would write A+ papers about them. You write these books because something hurts. You need to resolve something, and Milton definitely had a ton of resolving to do. I mean, this book was not written to just expose how brilliant this guy John Milton was, although you just read some of those passages and you think like, wow, Milton, you know, I'm with you, just keep going. Yes, please, more Milton, please. But deep down, it was a very personal book. And I hope that all of my notes on this book help you understand just the cosmic scope of his writing. He definitely is the most brilliant writer who has ever written in the English language. There's just no arguing with Milton. He spoke every language. He spoke Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. He wrote Latin poetry that was so superb that Florentine intellectuals thought that he's the best Latin poet of his time period, which is pretty darn absurd. Because this is the time when the vernacular language is already fully established. He's writing after Shakespeare, you know, Boccaccio and Dante already created their amazing Tuscan Italian masterpieces. So he is writing still good Latin poetry, solid, awesome, intellectually astute Latin poetry in a world where national literature is already being written in all of these vernacular languages. He puts absolutely everything into this book. The Reformation is there. The biblical and canonical texts are there. The Civil War is definitely there. And I loved your response to all of the little bits of information that I was adding to the reading about just to what extent this book was influenced by what was happening in England historically during this time period. So Milton, best ever, and I will accept no lesser praise for good old John. And those of you who did not get a chance to ever read Paradise Regained, I can't recommend it enough. It is truly, truly breathtaking. And he is actually writing Paradise Regained as he's revising. So he first wrote Paradise Lost in 10 books, and then he felt that, you know, Virgil's Aeneid is 12 books, and I am writing something that is as consequential for my culture as Virgil's epic was for late Republican, early imperial Rome. He decided to expand it to 12 books. Thank you, Virgil. And as he's revising it, and he didn't just add 2 books, he just went through the entire process of revising the entirety of Paradise Lost, and then completed it in 12 books. As he's making this revision, he's already writing Paradise Regained. And as you probably guessed, Paradise Regained is based on the New Testament, and it starts approximately with the baptism of Jesus. And then we have just this superb dramatic dialogue between Satan and Jesus Christ. And it is exhilarating. It is the most exciting thing. It's like superb debaters going at it, and they leave no stone unturned. It's just the entirety of the Roman Empire is discussed. And then just because that is not enough, then you get the entirety of the Athenian brilliance. So superb, absolutely superb. So if you are bored all through the cold, dark months of January and February, or January, December and January, the 3 books that I recommended in my bonus posts were Book of Job, Paradise Regained, and I have to give a shout out to Lord Byron. I mean, if ever was a writer who just decided to, like, you know, my role model is Milton Satan, and I'm just going to live my life completely following all of the advice that you can get from Milton Satan. And he really started the satanic trend of authorship and literary characters. And the Byronic character, all of his characters are superbly autobiographical in so many ways. The Byronic characters of Byron are all very, very, very satanic. And his Cain reads like a sequel to Paradise Lost. And both Cain and Satan are just so incredibly bad and so incredibly exciting at the same time. So I think that's it for my little introduction. And I would love to take questions. I see there's one question already typed in the chat, and I'll ask John to read it. And if you just want to raise your hands, I would love to answer your questions if I can. And if I can't, we'll give each other all a big hug.
All right, well, Kay had dropped in with the question that she says she assumes you've read this in Russian and Hungarian and wonders how it translates.
No, I decided to just stick to the English. I had a hard time forcing myself to read Russian poetry in English. It was the hardest thing for me to do. I've been teaching, and those of you who are looking forward to War and Peace starting on February 1, I've never taught War and Peace in Russian. I've always taught War and Peace in English translation because I just do not have students who would be able to handle Tolstoy in Russian. And Dostoevsky is even harder. Dostoevsky doesn't write in Russian, he writes in Russians. He creates a different Russian for each character. So when I go back from English and start reading Dostoevsky in Russian, it takes me a few days to just adjust to the complexity of his language. So always taught Tolstoy, always taught War and Peace and Anna Karenina in English. But I always wanted to teach Pushkin. I wanted to teach Pushkin so much. And I just was dragging my feet because I couldn't fathom teaching Pushkin in English. And I finally found a decent enough translation of Eugene Onegin. I've been teaching it for 3 years now, great results. I developed a fabulous Russian class called Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And we just basically read these marvelous Russian novels that deal with absolutely despicable human beings. I specialize in despicable human beings in mostly 19th century literature. So yes, I finally overcame my aversion to teaching Russian poetry and English translation. I have never touched Milton in any other language than English. Who knows, 10 years from now, maybe I'll be brave enough and I'll just say like, oh, what the heck, let's see what Milton sounds like in Russian, but I bet I'll run away after the first 3 lines. Any other questions? Just raise your hands or, yes, Carrie. And before Carrie starts speaking, let me introduce Carrie to you. So Carrie is the magical human being who is going to lead us on another literary adventure. And I will ask Carrie to tell us a little bit about this book called The Heptameron. And if it sounds like the Decameron, there's a reason for that. So please tell us about this project, Carrie.
Oh, thanks, Anna. Yeah, I was so inspired by Anna's, by the Decameron project this spring, which I loved so much. And I'm also a great fan of a work of French literature written by an author named Marguerite de Navarre a couple of hundred years later in the 16th century. It's also a story collection, and it's inspired by Boccaccio. And there are 10 storytellers. It's not set during a plague, but the storytellers have gone to visit the healing mineral waters in the Pyrenees, and then they're stuck there because there was a flood, and the bridge they need to cross to has been washed out. So they tell stories one a day per person, just like in the Decameron. Marguerite de Navarre died before she finished writing the collection, so there are only 72 stories. So it was titled by her daughter, The Heptameron, in honor of 7 full days of storytelling. So we're going to take a cue from Anna's project and do a 72 days of Heptameron, also starting on November 1st. So yeah, everyone is super warmly welcome to participate, and the stories are quite short. My question is, I'm so grateful to be able to connect in these ways virtually, even though it's what we're sort of stuck with. It's also been really wonderful. And I didn't realize that you had, prior to this, done the reading aloud of those other works, and which would also be wonderful. But I'm not in Iowa, I'm in Indiana, so I couldn't have heard those. But I was wondering, Anna, if maybe you might have thoughts on kind of the advantages and disadvantages of the in-person reading and the virtual reading, or maybe kind of, I don't know, compare those a little bit.
We reached several continents with this one. I mean, we have readers in Latin America, we have readers in Asia. It's remarkable how fast you can go global when you leave the confines of a physical space. The reason why I started reading those books on street corners is there's this perception culturally that books are just, old and boring and too long and completely irrelevant. And I find old books exhilarating. I mean, they did not survive hundreds of thousands of years for no reason at all. They survived because they touched on something that is so essential to all of us as human beings, that generation after generation touched these books with gratitude, just saying like, wow, how is it possible that this author who lived 600-700 years ago, how did this author knew that this is exactly how I feel about something that is very important to me? And so my criteria for the books was, let's take a book that in today's culture is considered too long, too boring, and too irrelevant, and make it short enough to read as a community, exciting and relevant. And the dialogue that every single one of these readings created was fantastic. But it is a long process. It is a very, very long process. And, standing on a street corner and making sure that the next reader shows up, and there's a new reader that comes every 20 minutes. And it takes some doing, and it takes some organizational skills. Doing it on Facebook is a lot easier. You don't have to worry about your book blowing away because it's too windy. You don't have to worry about cars driving by. You don't have to worry about sirens, dogs, children, roller skaters, bikes. You don't have to worry about all of those delightful things that happen when you are standing on a street corner and reading a book. You also don't get the really, really weird looks from passersby thinking like, wow, this one is a strange one. So yes, we were doing this out of the comforts of our snug quarantine homes. And it keeps you going. It's fascinating. I had so many responses from so many readers saying, the world is going to hell in a handbasket and we have no idea what happens day to day. But every morning we wake up and there's a comment from Anna. And so I'm just so glad that I was able to be the constant in so many people's lives for the past 100 days. First was Boccaccio and was 50 Days of Paradise Lost. And in a spirit of full disclosure, I don't speak Italian. I don't know anything about Renaissance Italy. I mean, that project was just, I know that there's a book out there that was written during the plague, and I read it way back when I was an undergraduate. I think that one I read in Russian, actually, because it was one of the books that I had to read when I was still studying the Soviet Union. So Boccaccio was with me way back when, and you know about this book. And I just thought, we can do this. Those stories are so darn inappropriate. We need to have some levity in our lives because everything in the world is just so incredibly crazy right now. Let's just read totally inappropriate tales from the 14th century because why not? With this book, it was a little more, I felt like I actually know a tiny bit what I'm doing. And so there's another question. John, would you mind reading it to me?
Get unmuted. Yeah, Alice has asked, are there contemporary authors that you are aware of that have strands of Milton's work in their work?
And that is a question for John Kenyon, because John knows that Anna Barker stubbornly refuses to enter modernity. I really stay put very happily in the 19th century. And, when I brandish this book around, Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, it is a 20th century book. Bulgakov died in 1940, and the book was pretty much finished at the time of his death. But this is the only 20th century book that I ever teach. I have issues with the 20th century, so I'm so sorry I do not have an answer. But yeah, every once in a while I venture into the 20th century and then I crawl back into the 19th century, feeling like I need the peace and tranquility that I find there. Nice. Any other questions?
Can I just, do you think Marilyn Robinson in her literature, I mean, she tends, when I read her, I think about Milton because but I wondered if you saw, I mean, I don't see a lot except for Marilyn. I'm not seeing that whole struggling with God and the devil in any literature really of late. Yeah. So right. I wondered your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Marilyn Robinson, absolutely, yes. The one author, if I could ever recommend a 21st century author, it would be Marilyn Robinson. She's superb. And it's fascinating what one of the students said in their reflection on Goethe's Faust. The student said that Goethe's Faust reads like Shakespeare, if Shakespeare would be writing about God. And I found that response so incredibly striking because Shakespeare does not write about God. And that is just the one thing that always puzzled me about it until I started actually studying English Reformation. And at the time when Shakespeare was writing his plays, mentioning God was fraught with severe consequences. I mean, your head could end up on a pole in front of the Tower of London. It was the time of Reformation and severe consequences for all who dealt with religion because the religious authority was going back and forth in England for so long. So yes, Marilyn Robinson absolutely touches on God.
What about
one of the things that
I was going to say, what about Hamlet? I mean, I just, to be or not to be, that whole, I think there's a lot of that in Hamlet. I see a lot of Milton in Hamlet.
It's definitely under the surface. But I can't imagine, I can't imagine anyone writing an actual, Christopher Marlowe, and here is Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Christopher Marlowe wrote a play about darkness and God. And he was a contemporary of Shakespeare. He also died under very strange circumstances in a tavern brawl in his late 20s. So we know so little about Christopher Marlowe and the circumstances of his life. One thing that I mentioned in one of my comments was when Adam is told about all of the repercussions that humanity is going to encounter after the fall, one of his most shocking realizations is that he will not be able to speak to God face to face. And it's fascinating how Milton is fully aware that the advent of the scientific revolution is going to cause the alienation of a human being from God. And I think what we are seeing, and we mentioned Marilynne Robinson as one of the few writers who still touches God in her writing. It's fascinating how Milton was still living at a time when human beings were close to God. And the rest of the 18th century, I mean, it was the Age of Enlightenment, and scientific revolution did happen. And that communion with God that Adam valued so much was completely gone, as Milton predicted.
Thanks.
I was just going to jump in real quick, and then we can get to Patrick on Alice's question. Before you had mentioned her, I was going to say Marilynne Robinson, simply because I don't know if anyone saw our book festival event we had with Marilynne and Sam Chang last night in partnership with Prairie Lights. But Marilynne was actually asked a question about why more contemporary writers don't address religious themes or deal with kind of man's relationship with God, and talked a little bit about that. I won't try to paraphrase her response, but I do think that the folks at Prairie Lights, I know they recorded that, and I hope they'll get that up on their Facebook page soon, and you might be able to check that out. It was a great conversation, and that was, again, a rare time where that topic was addressed.
And it's fascinating to what extent people asking that question more and more this year. I even see it in my students' papers. I mean, all of a sudden, my students who just always felt that we are reading like really, really fun books from the old days, my students all of a sudden wrestling God in their papers, and I find that one striking feature of this pandemic year. Patrick, you had a question.
Yes, thanks for doing this, and I really enjoyed it. I wondered if you think that, from your understanding of Milton's religious background and beliefs and all that, do you think that he took the events, the biblical events that he bases all of this on, the creation and all these things, if he took them literally, that they were literally true? Or do you think he saw this as an analogy or a metaphor, something of that nature?
And this is when I'm going to say no comment. I would not dare make any remarks about Milton's beliefs. He definitely is superbly well versed in theology and philosophy. And one of the fascinating things that I saw in his Paradise Regained, and I mentioned this in my comment, is to what extent he sees the advent of Christianity within the context of the Roman Empire and this overbearing, huge, unwielding government structure that brings forth the advent of a new religion. And it is so stunning to then go back to Milton, the historian who's writing about his time period, and he sees this Protestantism as something that was birthed by a culture that also became way too overbearing, way too dogmatic, way too enormously influential. And so he looks at everything in historical terms, but I would not venture into how Milton saw Christianity itself. And I saw several questions, so if John could read those to me.
Well, we had a question about how to join the Heptameron, and Carrie has shared a link in the chat. So for those who are interested in joining up on that, thank you, Carrie, for sharing that with us.
And it's Carrie's note is also, I posted it on the
Facebook.
on the Decameron page and on the Paradise Lost page.
Yes. And then Phil had chimed in. He said, I think it's interesting that a century after Milton, and William Blake, who, as we know, Milton was a great influence on, was writing about God and Satan in the time of the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot to unpack there.
And my students and I actually talked about all of this a great deal. There are just too many things happening all of a sudden in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. One, all of the Reformation wars, and in England it was several wars actually. I mean, the time of Milton can be divided into 3 distinct periods of a civil war, and that is, of course, during the Stuart period. Reformation happened during the Tudor period, so we had Henry VIII, who divorced himself from the Catholic Church, yet remained very Catholic in his outward expressions of faith. And then there's a lot of hopscotching for the throne, and we have all of a sudden a Catholic monarch, his daughter from his first marriage. So we go back to Catholicism, and then Mary dies without a child, and Elizabeth becomes the monarch, and she balances off all of the issues that were tearing England apart, but England becomes a Protestant country. But other fascinating things start happening because of Reformation. The Bible is translated into vernacular languages. So we have Luther translating the Bible and into German. We have the King James version that was published just before Milton starts writing Paradise Lost. And so because there is a standardized text of the Bible in all of these cultures, that facilitates a much broader dissemination of this book, right? And all of a sudden, everyone starts reading the one translation that is as splendid as the Luther Bible in German. And so the language of that book becomes the standardizing factor for the language in general, right? So we have a proliferation of one book, the language of which becomes the standard language of the entire country. In addition to that, we have the advent of the printing press. And so all of a sudden, books become much cheaper. You don't have to have one person copying one book for a year or 2 years. So you can print things very, very fast. And I told the students that they are living in a very similar age to the printing press age, because we have huge dissemination of information through the internet. And so I told the students that, you know, you don't always just go to the Huntington Library and Museum website to research the William Blake illustrations of Milton. Often you watch cat videos on YouTube. And that is the plus and the minus of huge proliferation of information. And the same thing happened with the advent of the printing press. So all of a sudden, you have Protestant countries, right, that have a Bible in their own language, much larger readership. But because it's a Protestant country, all of a sudden you don't have the lives of saints to read anymore, right? So more people are reading, books are cheaper to produce, but there's nothing to read because there are no more saints. And saints' biographies were hugely popular in Catholic countries. And so thus, the little niche is filled by all of these tales about the devil. And the devil becomes so incredibly prevalent also because people in Protestant countries, their faith is severely shaken by the fact that their countries go through these 100-year stretches where Christians kill Christians in the name of Christ. And so the whole concept of Christianity is hugely undermined. And so that's when all of these tales of the devil, Mephistopheles, Lucifer start proliferating, and you can print them cheaply and there's an audience who can read all of a sudden, especially city audience. And so the first Faust chapbook was very much so a product of these urban classes who are hungry to read and can afford to buy a cheaply printed, cheap little book. The rest is history. All of a sudden we have this huge proliferation in the 17th, 18th, 19th century of not just books, but then all of the art. And William Blake was not the only illustrator of Milton. Of course, Tousley was superb in his illustrations. And then if we're talking about Goethe's Faust, Delacroix, who could be a better illustrator than Goethe's Faust than Eugène Delacroix, and his illustrations are absolutely superb. Yes, other questions?
Well, we actually just had a couple of people who had to take off, but we don't have any other questions in the chat. One thing that I had been thinking about, though, Anna, while reading this was wondering, and you kind of just got at that when you were talking about the different translations into the vernacular, but what role this story or this book might have played in making people more aware of that tale and fleshing out details, and if people took away their details, like what they knew of the story of Adam and Eve and paradise from Milton's book rather than the Bible, or in addition to the Bible, like what was known, because obviously there are far more details in Paradise Lost than there are in the Bible because he's elaborating on things. Did that become what people then took away as their knowledge of that story, or were they able to separate fact from fiction, for lack of better terms?
Well, and this is totally the non-expert opinion by Anna Barker, because I would have to be an expert in readership and reading culture of that time period to be able to respond to that question in a sophisticated way. But this was not a book that was read by as many people as the Bible, right? So this is a very, very intellectual take on the biblical story. And it's fascinating to what extent these books are just adored by intellectuals, right? I mean, Goethe's Faust is not a book that you're just going to pick up and say, oh, you know, what the heck, I have a weekend of nothing to do, I'm just going to read Goethe's Faust. These books appeal to a very specific audience. And it's just fascinating to see to what extent these questions that both Goethe and Milton raise still not answered today. There was a reason why they raised these questions at the time when they did, still with us today. But I would have to be literally an expert on the reading culture of the 17th century in order to answer that question in any sophisticated way, shape, or form.
I just wanted to share that so I wasn't the only one thinking about it. So now you'll probably go look it up and you can tell me later. So
that's right. That's right.
Yes. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say we had another comment, but if you wanted to elaborate.
There was a hand here, please.
Okay, we had a comment from Phil in the chat, and then we can get to Kay. Phil had just mentioned, along with books about the devil, the 17th century was also the age when witches were persecuted in England, Scotland, and New England, so the devil was a feature of everyday life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's fascinating, they were looking for the devil everywhere.
Yeah, all right.
There was a lot of anti-devil activism at that time.
I think you may have just answered the question that I was going to ask, which was, as a modern reader, you know, there were a lot of times I had to look up the footnotes, and a lot of the references to, I got a lot of the biblical ones, but, you know, astronomy and historical and geography, a lot of those references were, I don't want to say they were lost on me because I did generally look up the footnotes, but my daughter was reading it along. We both did it, and she just sort of skimmed over all the footnotes. I'm really curious how familiar, well-read readers of the time would have been with all of the references that are lost on a lot of us modern readers.
Yeah, all the kids who graduated was a bachelor's and master's from Cambridge would have been fully aware of what Milton is writing about. But Milton didn't just get a, because Christopher Marlowe and Byron were also superbly well educated. But what happens then with Milton is he goes home to his mom and dad's house, and then he spends years reading. And so it was not just the college educated kids overview of all intellectual spheres, but he is very, very, very much though self-taught and a voracious reader. And then he doesn't just travel through the continent. He doesn't just, go to France and check out the Notre Dame, and he doesn't just go to Rome and have some ice cream. He actually does research in the Vatican Library. And so this book was written by someone who was superbly well educated, but also incredibly, incredibly voracious as far as research goes. So his contemporaries who were well educated would have been aware of all of his references. Did you have another question, John?
Yeah, we've exhausted the questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. I know you wanted to take the last couple of moments to talk about a new project. Maybe now's the time, unless someone else has a last question they'd like to jump in with.
Any final thoughts, questions? Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming along on this journey. I love this book, and I've given as much of my knowledge about this book as I could. There are Milton experts out there, and I challenge them to do a 100 days of Paradise Lost at some point and give us more information and more insight into this magical, marvelous book. I always felt so bad that I can't know more about these books until I listened to Leonard Bernstein's lectures about music, and specifically about Bach's St. Matthew Passion. He gives this wonderful, wonderful explanation of all of the complexity of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion in his beautiful, beautiful voice. And then Leonard Bernstein said something that changed my life. He said that the majesty and mystery of this composition will never be known by any human being ever. And that liberated me from feeling guilt about not knowing enough, and just saying what we touch here is superb. And without us touching it, it's just a book. When we touch it and we make it public, it's knowledge that is alive. And so that's what fascinates me about these projects, just continuing reading these incredible, incredible books. As we were finishing this project, when we got to about day 42, 43, 44, I started getting notes from readers saying, what are we going to do next? do you have any ideas about future projects? And I just finished reading Gilgamesh with my first-year students. I teach a first-year seminar that is called Cool Places and Hot Spots, and I basically prepare them for study abroad eventually. And I do all things international on campus, but because we couldn't do international things, I couldn't ask them, to go and experience an international concert to international book reading, or try different kinds of foods. I just thought we're going to read 2 books that will take them outside of today's culture. And so the 2 books that I assigned were both in the translations. I noticed there was a question about translation. Stephen Mitchell translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Book of Job. And I just finished discussing Gilgamesh with my 18-year-old University of Iowa students, and their response was phenomenal, just phenomenal. It touched a book that was 4,000 years old, and it did not intimidate them. They loved it, and they loved it precisely because it asked all of the difficult questions. So one of the difficult features about that book is, and I'm not going to give away plot twists, Gilgamesh has to deal with death. He's arrogant, he's big, he's brash, he's bold, he's huge, he's overbearing, he is an absolute monster of a king who is quite unstoppable. somewhere halfway through the book, he experiences a death of a close person to him, and I will say no more. And what it does to Gilgamesh is the most important aspect of this book. And so, so many of us lost loved ones this year, and our inability to deal with death is still with us. And the mourning of Gilgamesh, the severe psychological shock that he experiences when he is confronted with the incomprehensible is very much what a lot of people have experienced this year. So I decided to offer just a brief reading. There are 11 books in Gilgamesh, and we'll read 2 books on the first day on November 1st, and then we'll just read a book a day. And I'm dedicating this reading to everyone who passed away in 2020. It's a memorial reading that will help us figure out what it means to be mortal and what it means to be human. And Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. And even someone who is 2/3 divine has a very, very hard time dealing with departures. And that takes him on a path on sort of the hero's quest that is just as stunning and shocking and seemingly familiar and completely different from anything that we've experienced culturally as it can get.
Great, and I just dropped into the chat the link to the translation that Anna had mentioned. Kay had the question about the favorite translation. It's by Stephen Mitchell. And yeah, so any other thoughts, Anna?
Now I have to go and start researching Gilgamesh because I know nothing about the Middle East. No, just kidding. It's a great, great book. The fun thing is I've been researching art to post on Gilgamesh, and there isn't much because we did not know that this book existed till the 19th century. So for 4,000 years, there was really no reference to this book in Western culture. And so very, very precious little art has been created based on Gilgamesh, which is something that I think should be remedied in the 21st century. Right, and those of you who are looking ahead and wondering what to do after everyone is done with the Heptameron, my students have asked me, I've received overwhelming demands from my past students and current students to dedicate 100 days to War and Peace. I have to tell you, one of the students said, Anna, you should do 1,812 days of War and Peace, because it's about the year 1812. So that would be a fun project. So we'll do 100 days of War and Peace, February 1 through May 10. And that will keep us busy, and hopefully that will help us move out of dark, gloomy winter and into beautiful, blooming spring and new hope and a new year that will be absolutely lovely by comparison with 2020.
And hopefully we can have a session like this in person at the end of that project. So dare to dream.
We'll sit on a green lawn and drink champagne and toast Tolstoy.
Yeah, okay, you had something?
Yeah, I'll just follow up. Do you have a translation you could recommend of War and Peace?
Great. Well, I'm a very naughty person. I only recommend translators whom I met in person. So Richard Pavir and Larisa Volokhanskaya, I absolutely love their translations. And I have students who swear by Constance Garnett, and they are still reading 19th century translations of Tolstoy and loving them. And I won't argue with them, but I will be using the Richard Pavir and Larisa Volokhanskaya translation that divides War and Peace into 4 volumes. Any other thoughts? Well, this was fun, and thank you so much for going along with this MED project. And I'm just going to say goodbye to you and have a cup of tea. And then I have to teach. So this is the rest of my day. I'm teaching the Book of Job in my first year seminar. I'm finishing Goethe's Faust in my Pact with the Devil course. And I am teaching this fun little book, Dostoevsky's Idiot, in my Russian lit class. And then after that, we are still reading Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus and Nestor Margarita and Brothers Karamazov. So fun just never stops.
All right. Well, on that note, thanks to everyone for joining us today. And thank you very much, Anna, for your wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you.
And yeah, we appreciate it very much. And stay tuned for the next project.
Fabulous. I'll see you on May 15th on the Zoom for War and Peace.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.